Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Be Like Christ. We are on the home stretch, of our Bible study in the Gospel of Luke. We are in chapter 20 today. We are going to do verses 1 through 26, Lord willing, and then we will finish off chapter 20 in the next video. So here we go. If you do not yet have the verse-by-verse notes that covers all this material that I'm going to cover today in writing, there are links down in the description below to both physical copies and digital copies of those. So get them, and then you can make your own notes to correct all the mistakes that I made. Well, let's read verses 1 through 8 of Luke chapter 20. I'm reading from the English Standard Version, if you're wondering. And let's talk about this. So remember, the context is that we're in the last week of Jesus' life here. This is right before, a couple days before he is going to be crucified. Verse 1. One day, as Jesus was teaching the people in the temple and preaching the gospel, the chief priests and the scribes with the elders came up, and they said to him, "Tell us by what authority you do these things, or who it is that gave you this authority." And he answered them, "I also will ask you a question. Now tell me, was the baptism of John from heaven or from man?" And they discussed it with one another, saying, "If we say from heaven, he will say, 'Why did you not believe him?' But if we say from man, all the people will stone us to death, for they are convinced that John was a prophet." So they answered that they did not know where it came from. And Jesus said to them, "Neither will I tell you by what authority I do these things." Okay, so what's going on here? Well, one day, Jesus is teaching in the temple. He's confronted by the Jewish authorities. These are the chief priests, the scribes, the elders. So a little bit of a different group from, the typical, Sadducees and Pharisees, but, these are definitely the people who are around the temple a lot. The scribes kind of always hung out with the Pharisees, and they were probably an intermixing here of a bunch of different groups. But chief priests, scribes, elders, they come up to Jesus, and they wanted to ask him a question. And they asked him, "Who do you get your authority from? Whose authority do you use to perform these miracles? Whose authority do you claim in overturning the temple tables and casting out the money changers and the salesmen, as we talked about in a previous video? Where do you get your authority for preaching this new message that they believed was in opposition to the law of Moses?" That's what they want to know. And was this really an honest question? And the answer is no. Are you surprised? Probably not at this point. And Jesus knew that it wasn't an honest question. He had told them a million times where he got his authority from, and that was obviously from God. And God himself had spoken from heaven and confirmed that his authority rested with Jesus. But, they weren't really that interested in knowing the truth. They were trying to catch Jesus somehow and confront him and find a reason to get rid of him. So in order to expose their dishonesty, Jesus, he committed to answering their question, but only if they would answer one of his first. And so he asked them, "Was the baptism of John, was that from heaven or from man?" So essentially what he was asking was, did John the Baptist just make up his ministry and his message? Was he a fraud? Or was he actually a prophet from God who had a message from God? The Jewish leaders, they discussed this amongst themselves, and they quickly discovered that they were in a dilemma. They couldn't say that John had made up his teaching because it would put them out of favor with the common people. So out of favor, in fact, that they thought that the common Jews would stone them and kill them, because all the common Jews thought that John's ministry was indeed from God. So they are fearful of their life and also their reputation and the way that they'll look in front of others. So they're like, well, we can't say that John made it up, but we also can't say that it was from heaven. Because, if they admitted that it was from God, then Jesus would ask them, well, why didn't you listen to it then? And they certainly weren't willing to admit that they were wrong initially, and repent now. So they were going to have to stick with their original opinion and their original claims that John was a fraud. And not to mention, if they had come out and said that John's baptism was from heaven, then they would also have to accept Jesus. You couldn't take one or the other, because John introduced Jesus as the Lamb of God. So if they were going to say that John had his ministry from heaven, they were going to have to say that Jesus was also affirmed by heaven, and they certainly weren't willing to do that. So they were stuck. And like any good politician, they just dodged the question. They're like, we don't know. So their dishonesty had been exposed, and because of their inability to answer, or rather, their unwillingness to answer, Jesus was unwilling to answer their question. I think there's a good application here for us, and that is that, that's my second application. First application. So Jesus spoke boldly about the nature of God, right versus wrong, truth versus error, and his bold speech made a lot of people angry. In fact, it was going to make people so angry that they were going to kill him. I mean, the result of his bold speech was physical death. Now, on the flip side of that, the Pharisees, the scribes, the chief priests, the Sadducees, the elders, the lawyers, they refused to take a stand on controversial issues like this. And their cowardice and their silence, it preserved their safety and their reputation and their lives while they were on earth, right? They were afraid that the people were going to kill them. Whoops, computer's making noises. They were afraid that the people were going to kill them if they gave the wrong answer. So they backed out of it in their cowardice, and they preserved their lives for a while at least. But in the end of time, the script is going to be flipped. Those who spoke boldly for God will preserve their eternal lives when they meet God. Right? God will look at them. He will say, "You spoke boldly in my name. You glorified me. You affirmed me as the truth in the world, and therefore, because of that, you receive eternal life." Those who remain silent, though, to preserve their reputation and their physical lives, what's going to happen to them? Well, they're going to die spiritually. All right, so sure, playing the politician might keep you alive on earth a little bit longer, but in the end, it's not going to get you what you want. The second application, here we go, and that is that we see Jesus didn't allow his time to be consumed with answering questions from dishonest people. He wasn't interested in answering this question from these Jewish leaders, and the only reason that he usually did answer their questions was to show their hypocrisy and to humiliate them in front of the people, so that the people would know that they weren't people that needed to be followed, right? But as far as, he wasn't going to spend all of his time talking to these guys because he knew that they were dishonest. And we see Jesus many times moving on from dishonest people, like the people in Nazareth. They weren't willing to accept Jesus as the Messiah. So what did Jesus do? He didn't hang around there. He moved on to find honest hearts. In the Christian life, it seems like, especially on social media, I don't know why it's there, but you'll find people like this in person as well. People who ask questions with the sole intention of tricking somebody or tricking them or tripping them up. They're asking dishonest questions. And we should be careful about people like that. We don't want to allow close-minded critics to consume all of our time to the point that we don't have any time left to find the honest hearts in the world. I've met people that just spend all their time online arguing with these trolls who really aren't super honest about doctrinal issues or church practices and traditions, or maybe it's apologetics, right? And all of their time is consumed with arguing with these people who clearly aren't really interested in having a constructive debate. We don't see that in Jesus. when he met people like that, he would engage them sometimes, but when it was obvious that they weren't interested in listening, he would be moving on rather quickly. Okay, let's read verses 9 through 15. And he began to tell the people this parable. A man planted a vineyard and let it out to tenants and went into another country for a long while. And when the time came, he sent a servant to the tenants so that they would give him some of the fruit of the vineyard. But the tenants beat him and sent him away empty-handed. And he sent another servant, but they also beat and mistreated him shamefully and sent him away empty-handed. And he sent a third. This one also they wounded and cast out. Then the owner of the vineyard said, "What shall I do? I will send my beloved son. Perhaps they will respect him." But when the tenants saw him, they said to themselves, "This is the heir. Let us kill him, so that the inheritance may be ours." And they threw him out of the vineyard and killed him. What then will the owner of the vineyard do to them? So let's talk about the parable, and then we'll talk about the interpretation. There's this guy, this man, he has a vineyard, and he put a great deal of effort into the vineyard. Mark says that he put a fence around it, he dug a pit for the wine press, he built a tower, right? He was invested in this, and he leased the vineyard to some tenants because he was going to go on a long journey. He wasn't going to be there to care for the vines, and so he leased it to these people. They were supposed to take care of it, and then when the harvest time came, they would give him a percentage of the crops that they had grown as payment for allowing them to use that land. Well, around harvest time, the owner, he sent some servants back to the vineyard to collect what was due to him, but instead of paying the owner his fair share, the tenants ended up beating his servants and sending them away with nothing. The owner sent a second servant, but they also beat him, and they treated him poorly, and they sent him away with nothing. And then the owner sent a third servant, but that servant was pretty much treated just like the other two. So finally, the owner of this vineyard, he's trying to decide what he's going to do, and he says, "Well, I will send my beloved son." And he assumed that the tenants would have respect for his son because he was the heir of the vineyard. His father was the owner, right? He was a step above those other servants who they had mistreated. He thought, surely they will respect my son. But when the evil tenants recognized that the son was coming, they thought to themselves, well, this is our chance to own this vineyard. If we kill the son, then there's not going to be anybody to inherit this land, and eventually the owner is going to die, and it'll be ours. So they killed him. And Jesus concluded the parable with this statement, or rather this question to his listeners: what then will the owner of the vineyard do to them? So what's going to be their just deserts, or what justice is? What should the penalty be for the way that they treated this owner's servants and son? So let's think about the interpretation. Jesus doesn't give us an interpretation like he does for some of the parables, but I think based on the context, this one is somewhat clear. God had put a lot of work into the nation of Israel, just like the owner had put a lot of work into his vineyard. He had trusted the Jewish people to keep his commandments and his statutes. He had given them a special law, a special relationship with him. He had certainly been spent a lot of his patience on them, and he had rebuilt their nation multiple times after periods of sin and destruction and captivities. So God had put a lot of time into Israel. He'd been with them for a long time. He'd always been faithful to them. But they often failed him. They often didn't do what God wanted them to do. They weren't returning their side of the bargain, their side of the relationship. God had sent many messengers to the Jews to ask them to give him what he deserved: worship, reverence, faithfulness, single-hearted devotion, right? So the owner of the vineyard, around the harvest time, he deserved his due. And in the same way, God deserved his due from his people, but they treated God's messengers and God's servants very poorly when God sent them to him. And God continued to send messengers to the Israelites back in, if you read the Old Testament, you can read all these stories. So he'd send messengers to them. And he sent them eventually servants like Jeremiah or Ezekiel or Isaiah or Amos or Malachi. And the Jews had a reputation of abusing and beating and even killing some of the prophets. So eventually, God decides, well, I will send them my beloved son. That's the language of John 3:16 and the language, I believe, at Jesus' baptism. God's beloved son. And you would think that the people would respect the Son of God. But, like in the parable, that wasn't the case. Just a few days from when these words were spoken, the rebellious tenants of the nation of Israel would take Jesus outside the city and they'd kill him. They would attempt to make themselves the true rulers of God's people, right? They wanted the power and the authority. They didn't want anyone to take that away from them, even God. Right? So like the tenants think that they can take control of the vineyard if they kill the son. Well, the Pharisees, the elders, the chief priests, they're really just trying to hold on to their power by getting rid of Jesus. So Jesus was condemning the Jews through this parable, specifically the Jewish religious leaders, for being wicked tenants. So I think that's the interpretation. And we'll see that the Jews, this isn't lost on the Jews. We'll see in just a little bit. Let's read verses 15 through 16. And they threw him out of the vineyard and killed him. I have verse 15 here again. So we already read this one, but I wanted to read it again for context. And they threw him out of the vineyard and they killed him. What then will the owner of the vineyard do to them? Jesus answers his own question. He will come and destroy those tenants and give the vineyard to others. When they heard this, they said, surely not. Okay, so in Matthew's gospel, the Jewish leaders actually answer Jesus' question. So Jesus' question is, what then will the owner do to them? The wicked tenants. And the Jews, they respond in Matthew chapter 21, verse 41. He will put those wretches to a miserable death and let out the vineyard to other tenants who will give him the fruits of their seasons. Okay, so the Jewish leaders respond after hearing this parable. They're like, those tenants are definitely going to die. They're definitely going to have to pay for what they've done. That's what's right. So they judged the wicked tenants very quickly. They knew what ought to happen to the people who abused their position. Interesting that they could see other people's sins. They could see the sin of the people in the parable, but they couldn't see their own, even though they were doing the exact same thing. If you remember, there's another good illustration or example of this in the Old Testament where Nathan comes to David after his sin with Bathsheba, and he tells him this story about a man and a lamb and his neighbor taking his lamb from him. And David is outraged when he hears this story because he can see the sin in the man in the story, but Nathan ends up having to reveal to him that he had done the exact same thing. David was guilty of the sins that he was so quick to condemn in the man that Nathan told him about. So here we see that again. The chief priests, the elders, they're so quick to recognize sin in somebody else, but they can't see it in themselves. Luke doesn't record the response of the chief priests and the elders. We only have Jesus' confirmation, basically a restatement of their answer, it appears. So when Jesus did confirm their answer, something must have clicked in their minds, or Jesus must have indicated somehow that they were the tenants, because they immediately rejected his conclusion. They immediately backtracked on their passing of judgment. They said, surely not. Surely not. Surely that will not happen to us. Surely you're not talking about us. They rejected the idea that they were the wicked tenants, and they rejected the idea that they would be relieved of their spiritual leadership over God's vineyard. Okay, verse 17 and 18. But he looked directly at them and he said, "What then is this that is written, quote, 'The stone that the builders rejected has become the cornerstone. Everyone who falls on that stone will be broken to pieces, and when it falls on anyone, it will crush him.'" So this quotation is from the Old Testament scriptures. It's from Psalm chapter 118, verses 22 and 23. And it talks about this cornerstone. Well, Jesus describes himself as a cornerstone. Jesus was the cornerstone in God's work on earth. If you don't know what a cornerstone is, it was the very first and the most important stone that was laid in the foundation. And all of the other stones in the building were placed according to the level and the positioning of the cornerstone. So it was vital that that cornerstone was right because the rest of the building was based on it. Jesus describes himself as that cornerstone. But those who had been entrusted with the revelation of God, or the law of God, being the Jews, they were going to reject the cornerstone. They were going to reject what God was building. They were going to say, no, this cornerstone is not good enough. And that's what they said when they met Jesus. They didn't consider Jesus to be foundation material. Like the vineyard owner's son, they didn't respect him. And they were already making plans to get rid of him. They had dreams of some kind of a Jewish kingdom, Jewish Messiah, but Jesus wasn't going to fit that. However, the quotation says that, never mind. I was going to make that point. No, I'm not going to make that point. I don't think it's a very good one. Anyway, although the Jews rejected Jesus as the cornerstone, God had already accounted for their stubbornness, and he had woven his redeeming work and his will and his plan through the hardness of their hearts. He wasn't surprised that the Jews rejected Jesus. His will wasn't going to be stopped by their rebellion, and we ought to spend some time, I think, marveling at God's plan for salvation. The chess game that God plays on the earth is like a million steps above anything that we could ever strategize and figure out as human beings, right? He's playing in another dimension. It's good just to take some time to think about how incredible that is and how above and beyond us God really is. The foundation that Jesus was going to lay was the only eternal foundation. It's the only permanent foundation that's durable enough to overcome all adversaries. And there are forces that are going to come against the cornerstone, and they're going to try to destroy it, they're going to try to smash it, but no force is ever going to succeed. And when you think about history and those who have opposed Christianity and opposed the things that Jesus stood for and have opposed the worship of Jesus, the Jews were just the first in a long line of people who wanted to destabilize the kingdom of God. But it couldn't be destabilized, and it never will be destabilized because it's built on the sturdiest foundation in all of eternity. Let me see here. Verse 19 and 20. The scribes and the chief priests sought to lay hands on him at that very hour, for they perceived that he had told this parable against them, but they feared the people. So they watched him, and they sent spies who pretended to be sincere that they might catch him in something that he said, so as to deliver him up to the authorities and to the jurisdiction of the governor. So the scribes and the chief priests, they were furious at Jesus because he had basically, he called them wicked tenants, and he told them that they were going to lose their jobs and that the that the Jews, well, the true followers of God, were going to be entrusted to other people. So they decided that rather than repent, they were going to use some underhanded ways to get at Jesus and send some agents into the crowd. If they failed to challenge Jesus face to face, and so they were going to send in some of their sketchy servants to do their dirty work for them. They would do anything, basically, not to be defeated. Didn't matter what scumbaggery they had to get involved in. Their pride it so consumed them that they were willing to do anything. And in application from that, someone who loves truth and values truth is always going to be okay with being corrected. But somebody who's proud will go to any length to avoid what they perceive as the humiliation of correction. So we need to be mindful and aware of how we respond to correction. Our response to correction really reveals a lot about the condition of our hearts. And we should be aware of that when we're talking to other people as well, and knowing and feeling out and sensing what kind of a person we're talking to, so that we can spend our time wisely. And also so that we can know really what the root of the problem is. You could be arguing with somebody and maybe you're arguing about some doctrinal issue or something, and the person won't relinquish their position even though you feel like you've presented evidence, and maybe you have. Maybe the problem is not so much that you haven't articulated yourself clearly and that the problem is not that you haven't shown them sufficient evidence. The problem is that no amount of evidence is ever going to penetrate, because their pride has a wall up that is going to prevent them from ever making a change. So it's really a pride problem that you need to be dealing with rather than an academic discussion about a doctrinal issue. Okay, verse 21 through 26. So they asked him, "Teacher." So these are those the agents, the disciples of the Pharisees and the Jewish leaders. They've come to Jesus and they ask him, "Teacher, we know that you speak and teach rightly and show no partiality, but truly teach the way of God." Right, okay. "Is it lawful for us to give tribute to Caesar or not?" But he perceived their craftiness, and he said to them, "Show me a denarius. Whose likeness and inscription does it have?" And they said, "Caesar's." And he said to them, "Then render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's." And they were not able in the presence of the people to catch him in what he said, but marveling at his answer, they became silent. So the sneaky spies came to Jesus, and they asked him a question about taxes. Always a controversial issue. They started off with some flattery, hoping to conceal their true intentions. And I don't know if Jesus ever rolled his eyes, but this would have been the time that he would have if he did. And they come up to him and they ask, "Is it lawful to give tribute to Caesar or not?" Basically, should you pay your taxes or not? So what was their angle here in asking this question? They weren't interested in tax law. They probably thought they could trap Jesus no matter which way he responded. So, think about this. If he told the people that they should pay their taxes and that he approved of that, well, he was probably going to lose some popularity with the common Jewish people, because the Jewish leaders could kind of paint him as a Roman sympathizer. And the common Jewish people hated the Roman occupation and the fact that they were ruled by the Romans. So anything that Jesus could have said and that even sounded potentially like he was supporting the Romans could be used against him by people who wanted to twist his words and tarnish his reputation, right? So they thought, if he answers that way, we'll get him. But if he answers the other way, we can get him too. Because if Jesus says, "Oh no, don't pay your taxes to Caesar," Well, the Jewish leaders are going to run off to the Romans and tattle on him and say, "Oh, Jesus is out here preaching that you shouldn't pay your taxes. You guys need to arrest him and punish him for this and throw him in jail." So they're thinking, sweet, this is a great question. They've probably been thinking about this and for mulling over it for like several weeks. They're like, this is the one. We're going to get him. Genius. So, so they come to him and they approach him with this, and Jesus was not deceived by their flattery. He knew immediately what they were up to. In Matthew's account, he just straight up calls them hypocrites in Matthew 22, verse 18. Jesus then asks for a denarius, which was the coin that was probably used to pay taxes to the Romans. If you have the notes, there's a photograph of a denarius that was found, and this is actually the same face that Jesus would have been looking down at, the face of Tiberius Caesar. That's the same one that's in the photo in the notes. So if you don't have those, definitely grab those. Who knows? Maybe this was the same coin that Jesus was holding. That would be pretty cool, but absolutely no way to prove that. I'm sure somebody has claimed it at some point, but anyway. So there's a picture of denarius there. So clearly you can see Tiberius Caesar imprinted on that coin with his arching Roman nose like a true Roman and his almost bull haircut on the bust that's pictured there. Tiberius Caesar was emperor from 14 AD to 37 AD, so this really would have been the majority of Jesus's life. Well, yeah, the majority of Jesus's life, at least the definitely the latter half of Jesus's life. And all throughout Jesus's ministry, Tiberius would have been in charge. So Jesus looks at this coin and he asks kind of an obvious question. He says, "Whose likeness is on this coin?" And they respond, "Well, Caesar's." So Jesus told the people to give Caesar what belonged to him and to give God what belonged to him. And you'll have to forgive me if there's some conjecture here, but I can't help but think that Jesus was asking the people to connect an unstated truth when he was talking about the likeness on the coin. Why did Jesus ask for the coin in the first place? Everybody knew who was on the coin. They didn't physically need to see it. I think it may have been an object lesson. Jesus was setting up his critics and the listening audience for a truth that the coin revealed about their relationship with God. Jesus' enemies confirmed that the coin bore Caesar's likeness, and Jesus told them that what bore Caesar's likeness belonged to Caesar, so give Caesar his silver if he asks for it. But if Jesus is talking to Jews, and if these Jews had known the scriptures like they should have, even the most basic, very first parts of the scriptures, Genesis chapter 1, they would have also had to confirm a greater truth that was based on this principle. Caesar's likeness was on the coin, but whose likeness did they bear? If you've ever read Genesis 1, you'll know the answer to that question. Men and women have been made in the likeness of God. So what's Jesus saying here? Well, it meant that what bore God's likeness belonged to God. So give Caesar your silver, but give God your life and your heart and your mind, because all of that bears his likeness and all of it belongs to him. So it's possible to read this text, or that it should be understood as Jesus saying, "Show me a denarius. Whose inscription does it have?" And they said, "Well, Caesar's." And he gesturing to the coin says, "Then render to Caesar what is Caesar's." But then gesturing to all of the individuals, all of them in their human selves made in the likeness of God, Jesus is saying, "And give God what belongs to him." It was certainly a masterful answer. I mean, it's an incredible answer, especially Jesus didn't have time to prepare for this answer, right? It's not something he's sat around and thought about for several days. At least the way that the crowd saw it. Jesus knew it was coming, obviously, because he was omniscient, but this was an answer that he basically presented on the fly, if you can even use that terminology about Jesus. And I think Jesus' critics even realized how masterful of an answer it was, because it says in the text that they marveled at his answer and they didn't have anything to say back to him. So it was the perfectly balanced answer of how to deal with the government and how to deal with God and your obligation to each of them. And in application here, I know that this isn't really the main point of this text, but I think it is important to note that Jesus instructed people to pay their taxes to the government. We may not agree with everything that the government supports or gives money to, but we are to fulfill our responsibility as citizens. Jesus certainly did not support everything that the Roman government stood for, but I am glad that this text is in the Bible, because otherwise I think I might have a dilemma of conscience giving money to the government, or even a large organization that supported anything that was sinful. Yeah, the government supports abortion and unnatural marriages, and it verbally supports sins from time to time. But what we are told here indirectly is that we ought to let God deal with that we are not going to be held responsible for the way that some people abuse our tax dollars. God permits governments to exist. He tells us to pay our taxes. God will sort out the corruption in the end. That doesn't need to be our job. And so in a lot of ways, I find that to be kind of a comforting thing, because just give it to the just judge, and I don't have to worry about it as much. Not that we shouldn't stand up against that sin and corruption and protest it and speak out verbally against it, but as far as our tax money goes, God is going to be the one who balances the books on that stuff in the end. All right, well, we are going to finish there for today. And then in the next video, we're going to talk about the Sadducees coming up to Jesus. They've got some questions of their own, and they're going to try to trick him. But surprise, surprise, they're going to get embarrassed like the Pharisees and the chief priests. So, all right, I hope you have an excellent day. And Lord willing, I will talk to you again tomorrow.